Korea, 1919. In a small city called Pyongyang, a prison cell, stone walls, a dirt floor, and outside the sound of 1,000 voices being silenced one by rifle fire and drawn swords. Inside the cell, a man sits with his back against the wall. He is 31 years old. He has been beaten so severely that his right eye is swollen shut, and 3 of his fingers on his left hand bend at angles that fingers do not naturally bend. He did not end up here by accident. He walked into a Japanese military garrison on a Tuesday morning and told the officer in charge that what his soldiers were doing to the Korean people was an offense against God and against every principle of human dignity. The officer had him arrested before he finished the sentence. Now he sits in the dark, not praying for not bargaining, just sitting with the same settled expression that everyone who has ever known him will later describe in exactly the same words, as if they had agreed on the language beforehand. He looked like a man who had already decided something, who had decided it a long time ago, and was simply living in the consequences of that decision, and found those consequences entirely acceptable. His name was Gil Jong-hyun, and the story you are about to hear will not allow you to stay comfortable with a small life. Comment below with, "I am still here," if you are ready to keep walking toward the thing that cost you the most. And stay with us until the very end of this video, where we will reveal the one daily practice that sustained Gil Jong-hyun through 30 years of occupation, imprisonment, and loss. A practice so ordinary it will surprise you, and so powerful that those who witnessed it said it changed the atmosphere of any room he entered. Gil Jong-hyun was born in 1888 in the province of Hwanghae, in the northwest of Korea, into a family that had served the Joseon dynasty for 3 generations. His grandfather had been a court scholar. His father kept the family's connection to Confucian learning alive in a household that smelled of ink and old paper, and the particular silence that settles over a place where serious people do serious reading. He was the 3rd of 5 children. The first thing anyone noticed about him was his memory. By the age of 9, he could recite entire passages of classical Chinese texts after hearing them twice. His teacher, an elderly man named Master Cho, told his father with complete seriousness that the boy was either extraordinarily gifted or extraordinarily haunted, and that in either case he would need watching. His mother was the deeper influence. She was a small woman with large hands who had converted to Christianity through a missionary meeting in 1893. Quietly, without drama, without telling her husband until 3 weeks later. When she finally told him, he did not speak to her for 11 days. On the 12th day he came to her and said he had been watching her, and she seemed the same person she had always been, only calmer, and he wanted to know what she had found. She told him. He listened. He did not convert, but he never opposed her faith again. She took Jong-hyun to church every Sunday from the time he was 4 years old. She read to him from the Korean New Testament each night before he slept. She did not explain Christianity to him as a system of beliefs. She explained it as a relationship with a person, a specific person, with a name and a face and wounds in his hands, and a voice that spoke in the language of whoever was listening. When Jong-hyun was 12, his mother became ill. It was a lung condition, slow and grinding, and it took her across 18 months of increasing frailty before it finally took her entirely. He sat with her in those final weeks and watched something he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and never quite managing to. She was dying. She knew she was dying, and she was not afraid, not performing calm, not suppressing fear. Simply and genuinely unafraid, in the same way a person is unafraid of walking into a house they have lived in for years. She died on a Thursday morning in March, holding his hand, with an expression on her face that he would later describe in a sermon as the look of someone who had just recognized a face in a crowd. He burned nothing after she died. He did not rage. He went very quiet instead, which in some ways was worse. The hunger she had planted in him had no one left to direct it, and it turned inward and went still, like a fire that has run out of visible fuel and begun to burn on something deeper. He was not yet sure what he believed. He knew what his mother believed. He knew how she had looked when she died. He spent the next 3 years reading everything he could find. Confucian texts, Buddhist sutras, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the early Christian writers his mother had kept in a small wooden box under her bed. He was not looking for comfort. He was looking for truth. There is a difference, and he knew the difference even at 15. In 1905, the year Japan formalized its protectorate over Korea, Jong-hyun was 17 years old and standing at the edge of a decision that would define every year that followed. He had been offered a position studying law in Tokyo. His father wanted him to take it. The family's financial situation had deteriorated since his mother's death, and a legal career in the new imperial administration was a path to stability that few Korean young men of his generation could access. He turned it down. He had read, the night before he was supposed to give his answer, a passage in the Gospel of Mark. He would tell this story many times over the years, always with the same quiet precision, never embellishing it. He had read the passage where Jesus asks his disciples who they say he is, and in the silence of reading, in that small room with one lamp burning, something happened that he never fully explained and never stopped referring to. He closed the book. He sat for a long time. Then he went to his father and said he would not be going to Tokyo. His father asked why. He said he had decided to follow Christ. His father did not speak to him for a month. The years that followed were years of formation, ordinary and unremarkable on the surface. He enrolled in a small Christian school in Pyongyang. He studied theology, history, and languages. He swept the floors of the dormitory in the early mornings because the stipend barely covered his expenses and he had too much pride to ask for more help than he was already receiving, and too much humility to resent the sweeping. His teachers noted that he was a serious student who asked questions that took longer than usual to answer, not because he was slow, but because the questions themselves were careful, as if he had already thought through the obvious objections before he asked. He was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1913. He was 25 years old. He was assigned to a small congregation in a market town 2 hours south of Pyongyang, 300 members, a leaking roof, and a community of people who were already living under the daily pressure of Japanese colonial administration. He spent 6 years with that congregation. He did not do anything famous in those 6 years. He preached. He visited the sick. He sat with people who had lost family members to colonial labor conscription. He learned in those years that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a weight to be shared, and that the most important thing a pastor can do is sometimes simply to sit in the same room as the grief without trying to make it leave before it is ready. He also prayed. This is the fact that everyone who knew him in those years mentions first, before they mention his preaching, before they mention his pastoral care. He prayed every morning before dawn, alone for 2 hours. Not reading, not planning, not preparing sermons, sitting in silence and prayer. His neighbors in the market town grew so accustomed to the light in his window before sunrise that they used it as a kind of informal clock. If the light is on, it is before 4. If the light is off, it is after 6. The discipline was invisible, but nothing about his public ministry was separable from it. March 1919. The March 1st movement. The Korean people, under 31 years of mounting oppression, chose a Tuesday to sign a Declaration of Independence and read it aloud in city squares across the country. It was the largest coordinated act of nonviolent resistance in Korean history. Japanese soldiers responded with mass arrests, public beatings, and in some locations massacre. Gil Jong-hyun was one of 33 signatories of a parallel statement drafted by Christian and Buddhist leaders in Pyongyang. He knew exactly what signing it would cost him. He had watched, for 6 years, what the colonial administration did with dissent. He signed it in his own hand, with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything, and then he walked to the garrison to deliver a personal statement and was arrested before he handed it over. He spent 4 months in that prison. What happened inside that prison is documented through 3 sources. His own letters, smuggled out through a guard who was the son of one of his congregation members. The testimony of other prisoners who were released before him, and a brief account he gave years later in a church in Seoul that someone in the audience wrote down almost verbatim. He did not spend those 4 months in despair. He spent them preaching to the other prisoners, not formally, not with a Bible, which they had taken from him on the first day. From memory, in a low voice, in the early hours of the morning before the guards changed shifts, he recited scripture to whoever wanted to listen. He taught. He answered questions. He led, from memory, Worship services in a cell, so the floor was cold, stone and the walls were damp, and the man next to him had a broken arm that was not properly set and would trouble him for the rest of his life. One of the prisoners in that cell was a young man named Baek Sung-won, 18 years old, arrested for distributing pamphlets. He had not been a Christian before his arrest. He came out of that prison 4 months later, after Jong-hyun's release, and went immediately to the nearest church to be baptized. He later became a pastor himself, and in his own account of his conversion he said simply, "I watched how he prayed." That was enough. Jong-hyun was released in August 1990, thinner by 20 pounds, with the damaged fingers on his left hand that would never fully straighten, and a calm that people who met him for the first time in those weeks after his release found deeply disorienting. He did not look like a man who had been beaten and imprisoned and had watched unarmed civilians killed outside the walls of his cell. He looked like a man who had been on a long retreat and had come back with something that retreat had given him. He went straight back to preaching. The following decade was the decade of his greatest influence and his greatest loss. He returned to Pyongyang. He was given, after some internal debate among the Presbyterian leadership who were not entirely certain what to do with a man who had publicly confronted the colonial authority, a congregation in the northern part of the city. The congregation had 400 members when he arrived. Within 5 years, it had 1,200. This is not a story about a charismatic preacher who filled seats through entertainment. Those who heard him preach in those years consistently described the same quality: plainness. He did not use rhetorical devices. He did not modulate his voice for effect. He stood at the front of a room and spoke as if he were describing something he had personally witnessed, because that was exactly what he was doing. One woman who heard him in 1923 said later, many years later, that listening to him was the only time in her life she had felt certain that heaven was a real place rather than a comforting idea. In 1924, his wife, Yoon Hae-suk, whom he had married in 1916, died of typhoid fever. She was 31 years old. They had 2 children, a daughter of 6 and a son of 4. Jong-hyun buried her on a Saturday and preached the following Sunday. The congregation sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was very heavy. He preached on the passage where Jesus stands at the tomb of Lazarus and weeps. He said nothing about his wife directly. He did not need to. The whole sermon was about her, in the way that the most honest things are said without being said. His daughter, Ju-young, later remembered that her father did not stop the morning prayer routine even in the weeks after her mother's death. She woke once, at around 4 in the morning, and saw the light under his door and heard him inside, not weeping, not audibly, but present. Inhabiting that place he went every morning before the sun came up. She said it was the most frightening and the most comforting thing she had ever heard at the same time. The 1930s brought increasing pressure. The Japanese colonial administration, in an effort to consolidate ideological control over the Korean population, began requiring attendance at Shinto shrine ceremonies. The directive applied to schools, civic organizations, and eventually to churches. It was framed officially as a cultural gesture, not a religious one. Most of the Presbyterian leadership, under enormous pressure, accepted this framing and complied. Jong-hyun did not. He sent a letter to the colonial governor's office in 1936 that was 14 pages long and written with the meticulous courtesy of a man who has been trained in Confucian formal address and the absolute inflexibility of a man who has decided that some hills are worth dying on. The letter argued, point by point, that shrine attendance was inherently a religious act, that requiring it of Christians was a violation of the freedom of conscience that even the colonial administration's own formal policies claimed to protect, and that he would not be complying, and neither would his congregation, and that the governor's office was welcome to do with that information whatever it chose. The governor's office chose to arrest him again. This second imprisonment lasted 14 months. It was harder than the first. He was 50 years old. The beatings left damage that a younger body might have recovered from more completely. He was held in a cell that was deliberately kept cold in a building designed less for punishment than for the systematic erosion of will. A place intended to produce not pain but exhaustion, not defiance, but the slow departure of the desire to be defiant. What they did not calculate was a man who had been getting up before dawn every morning for 30 years. The prisoners in his cell block later testified, through accounts collected after liberation in 1945, that Jong-hyun conducted himself in that second imprisonment with the same quality they all struggled to name, but kept reaching for the same word to describe: steadiness. Not courage in the dramatic sense, not the courage that burns hot and looks impressive. Steadiness in the way that a lamp is steady, present, quiet, reliable, and warm. He was released in 1938 when his health deteriorated to a point the prison administration considered a liability. He was taken to a hospital where the doctor who examined him said privately to the nurse that he was surprised the man was still alive. Jong-hyun, who overheard this, said from behind the curtain that he was not surprised at all, and that God was not finished with him yet, and would the doctor mind telling him what day it was because he had lost track. The doctor told him. He asked if there was a Bible in the hospital. There was. He asked if someone would bring it to him. Someone did. He opened it to the Psalms and began reading from the beginning, quietly to himself, in that hospital bed, with the damaged hands and the battered frame and the expression, already returning, of a man who has decided something and found the consequences entirely acceptable. He never fully recovered physically. The lung damage from those 14 months of cold, the accumulated effects of 2 imprisonments, and the decades of Himalayan Korean winters, spent in drafty church buildings and on the road visiting parishioners in remote mountain villages, had left him diminished in body in a way that those who saw him for the first time after 1938 found difficult to reconcile with the accounts they had heard of the man before. In spirit they found him exactly as described. He continued preaching. He was forbidden by the colonial administration from any public ministry, a directive he observed to the letter and violated in spirit by conducting informal gatherings in private homes. The gatherings were never large. 12 people, 20 people, sometimes 30, crowded into a living room or a church kitchen. He did not preach formal sermons at these gatherings. He sat in a chair because standing for long periods had become difficult, and he talked. He answered questions. He told stories. He prayed aloud, and the quality of his praying is something that almost every account of those gatherings mentions, not what he said, but the way it felt to be in the room when he was saying it. As if the room had become, for that period, a different kind of place. His daughter Ju Young, by then in her early 20s and working as a teacher, attended many of these gatherings. She later wrote, in a memoir published in 1978, that her father's prayers in those years had a quality she had no secular language for. The closest she could come, she wrote, was to say that he prayed the way a man speaks to someone standing directly in front of him. No performance, no elevated rhetoric, just conversation, intimate and specific, and entirely convinced of the presence of the other person. In one of these gatherings, in the winter of 1942, a young woman named Park Yoon-sil was present. She had come reluctantly, brought by a friend, wanting nothing to do with Christianity, having watched too many Korean Christians comply with the shrine requirements she considered a spiritual betrayal. She sat in the back of the room with her arms crossed and waited for the evening to be over. Jong-hyun was talking about prayer that night. Not about the content of prayer, about the act. About what it does to the one who prays. The slow rearrangement that happens over years when you bring a self before God every morning, the way it erodes certain things, impatience, and the need to be impressive and the fear of smallness. He was talking about this without sentimentality, plainly, as if reporting an observable phenomenon. He said, at one point, that the reason most people did not pray was not theological doubt, but the fear of what they might be asked to surrender. Park Yoon-sil walked home that night in the snow and did not sleep. She returned the following week. She came to faith that spring. She later became one of the foundational figures of the Korean women's Christian education movement, and in an interview given in 1985 she said that the night she heard Gil Jong-hyun talk about prayer was the night she stopped running from the thing she had always known was true. August 1945. Liberation. Korea was freed from Japanese colonial rule after 35 years, and the country erupted in a grief and joy so tangled together that people wept without being able to say which emotion was winning. Jong-hyun was 57 years old. He stood in his church building for the first time in years, legitimately, publicly, legally, and he preached a sermon that lasted 45 minutes and said almost nothing about politics and almost everything about faithfulness, about what it means to hold on to something in the dark when you cannot see your hands in front of your face, about the way God keeps promises across spans of time that feel, to the person inside them, like abandonment. The congregation of 1,200 had survived, scattered, diminished, some members lost to the war, some lost to the privations of those years, but the core of it intact, and larger in some ways than it had been before, because suffering, when it is survived together, produces a particular kind of bond that nothing else creates in quite the same way. He preached for 5 more years after liberation. The Korean War came in 1950 and took everything that the colonial occupation had not already taken. And in the chaos of those early months of the war, in the mass displacement of the northern population, Jong-hyun was among those who moved south with his congregation, walking the roads with his people, sleeping in fields, arriving in Busan with nothing but the clothes he was wearing, and his Bible, which he had kept on his person through everything, through both imprisonments, through the hospital, through 30 years of Saturday nights spent reading it by whatever light was available, so that Sunday morning would not find him empty-handed. He died in Busan in 1952, in a refugee settlement outside the city. He was 64 years old. His daughter was with him. She later wrote that his last coherent day was spent in conversation, receiving the stream of people who came to sit with him, neighbors in the settlement, members of the scattered congregation, young people from the neighborhood who had heard about him and come simply to be in the room with someone they had heard was remarkable. He spoke to each of them. He prayed with each of them. He said to one young man who asked him what the most important thing was, that most important thing was to begin. To begin the practice of bringing yourself before God every morning before the world fills up with noise. That everything else, the endurance, the clarity, the freedom from the fear of what powerful men can do to your body, everything else was downstream, from that one daily act of showing up in the dark before anyone was watching. He closed his eyes that evening and did not open them again. His daughter sat with him through the night, and she reported that his face in those hours had the same expression she had seen on her grandmother's face when her father had described it to her so many years before. The look of someone who has recognized a face in a crowd. His books remained in print in Korea through decades of rapid change and modernization. His letters from prison were published in 1960 and became, in a Korea still rebuilding from the war, something that passed from hand to hand in churches and seminaries and college dormitories. Young men and women read them and made decisions. Congregations in Seoul and Busan and Daegu traced the roots of their founding to people who had sat in that northern Pyongyang church in the 1920s and heard a plain-speaking man describe the presence of God as if it were the most ordinary and most astonishing fact of his daily life. The discipline was the showing up, every morning before dawn, every morning before anyone else stirred, before the noise came, before the demands came, before the fear came. He showed up. God came, and what came from that morning's silence outlasted 2 imprisonments, a colonial occupation, a war, and everything else that history had decided to test him with. The question is not whether God could use someone like Gil Jong-hyun. You already know the answer. The question is what happens in the room before your day begins. What would change over 30 years if you decided to find out?